Welcome to this explainer. I am absolutely thrilled you're here today because we are diving deep into a massive shift in digital privacy that, frankly, affects almost everyone watching. We're going to look at the dramatic legislative revival of the EU's chat control and unpack exactly what it means for the future of our digital lives. It's a story packed with controversy, high-stakes technology, and a massive paradigm shift. Let's just jump right into it.
Section 1. The Zombie Bill rises. How a loophole revived a controversial law.
So our story actually kicks off in July of 2026. The European Parliament did something pretty unexpected. They resurrected a highly contested digital surveillance measure that had literally just expired a few months prior. It was this surprise maneuver right before the summer recess that brought a deeply debated law completely back from the dead. But before we look at exactly how they pulled that off, I want you to ask yourself something. Are your private messages actually private? I mean, think about your daily digital footprint for a second. Your emails, your direct messages, those quick chats with friends. You probably just assume that unless you've done something illegal, those messages are for your eyes only. Well, as we're about to see, the legislative reality paints a very, very different picture.
Now, the math behind how this bill passed is just fascinating. You've got 314 members of the European Parliament voting against it and only 276 voting in favor, right? A clear majority of the voters opposed it. So you might be wondering, how on earth is it a law? Well, it all comes down to a really specific procedural loophole under second reading rules. The opponents needed an absolute majority of 361 votes, meaning 361 of all available seats, to actually block it. Because they felt just short of that specific threshold, the bill slipped through and passed, despite the majority of the people in the room actually voting against it.
And because of that wild vote, this interim measure, which is often called Chat Control 1.0, is officially back. It is legally active all the way until 2028. So for the next few years, the suspicionless scanning of private digital communications is fully authorized across the entire European Union.
All right, moving to Section 2. Inside chat control mechanics. How mass scanning actually works.
The primary target of this legislation is combating child sexual abuse material. Obviously, that is a horrific crime that absolutely must be eradicated. But to achieve that goal, the implementation requires unprecedented scanning mechanisms on the apps you likely use every single day. We're not just talking about obscure, dark corners of the internet here. This legislation legally permits tech companies to scan citizens' private digital interactions on massive platforms, without a warrant, without judicial oversight, and without any prior suspicion of criminal activity. So whether you're sending an email on Gmail, chatting on your Xbox, or just messaging a friend on Instagram, you are operating within this scanning net.
Okay, let's really dive into this. How do they actually scan billions of messages in real time? It basically boils down to a two-part automated software process. Step 1 is hash matching. This compares your uploaded files and images against a massive, existing database of known illegal material. Then, Step 2 is AI-driven analysis. This is where algorithms actively scan your unrecognized text and media patterns to detect new grooming behaviors. And all of this is completely automated, happening silently in the background of your daily digital life.
But there is a massive caveat right now. End-to-end encrypted apps, think WhatsApp and Signal, are currently exempt under this 1.0 version of the law. However, keep in mind this is just an interim law. Negotiations for Chat Control 2.0, which actively aims to force client-side scanning directly onto those encrypted devices, are slated to resume in late 2026. So, that encryption shield you might be relying on, it may only be temporary.
Let's look at Section 3, Analyzing the Polarization, the Privacy versus Security Debate.
It is absolutely no surprise that this has created a fierce, highly polarized debate. Let's break down the core of this divide. Proponents of the bill point to the strengths and the chances, right? They argue this law gives tech companies the legal certainty they desperately need to voluntarily hunt for horrific criminal material without violating existing EU privacy laws. Plus, it hands law enforcement active, automated leads to dismantle these exploitation rings. But on the other side, critics point heavily to the weaknesses and the risks. They argue that algorithms just aren't perfect. High false positive rates flag completely innocent family or medical photos, which basically buries the police in junk data. Furthermore, security experts are warning that this creates a very dangerous precedent for systemic, permanent mass surveillance. At the philosophical core of the privacy argument is the destruction of what experts call digital letter secrecy. Historically, democratic societies have strictly protected physical mail, meaning the state absolutely cannot open your letters without a strict judicial warrant. Privacy advocates argue that chat control totally destroys this standard for the digital age.
It does this by essentially treating every single citizen as a presumptive suspect whose digital letters have to be pre-screened by corporate algorithms before they are ever delivered to the recipient.
Which brings us to Section 4, the mission creep warning. Where does surveillance stop?
When you start building the infrastructure for mass surveillance, privacy advocates naturally raise serious questions about its limits. I want to share this really powerful quote from digital rights advocate Patrick Breyer, because I think it perfectly humanizes the opposition's argument against building this network. He says, "Trying to protect children with suspicionless mass surveillance is like frantically mopping the floor while the faucet is still running. Blanket chat control is just as unacceptable as indiscriminately opening everyone's physical mail."
The crucial point critics are making here is all about mission creep. History shows us that surveillance tools rarely just stay contained in their original box. Privacy experts fear that once this mass scanning infrastructure is permanently integrated into our networks, the threshold to expand it becomes so much lower. They warn that, sure, while today it's being used for severe crimes, tomorrow it could easily be weaponized by future governments to scan for political dissent, copyright violations, anti-government speech, or even minor financial infractions.
All right, final segment, Section 5, Web 4 and Data Sovereignty, the technological response.
So, with these battle lines clearly drawn between state regulation and digital privacy, how is the tech world actually responding? Well, enter Web 4, and this concept of complete data sovereignty. To really understand Web 4, we have to look at its fundamental standard, Zero Knowledge Proofs, or ZKPs. I know it sounds super dense, but it's actually brilliant. A ZKP is just a cryptographic method that allows you to prove something is true without ever revealing the underlying data. For example, you can mathematically prove to a website that you're over 18 without ever showing them your actual ID card or your birth date. You prove your legitimacy without exposing your private content to any third party or government node.
Think about how this builds a completely new type of internet. In our current Web 2 reality, your data just sits on centralized corporate servers owned by companies like Meta or Google. That makes them incredibly easy targets for state coercion and these new scanning laws. But Web 4 is built on what's called sovereign edge intelligence. All the data processing happens locally, right on your own hardware. Your private data literally never leaves your device. Only fully encrypted, mathematically proven tokens are exchanged across the network.
And because of this specific architecture, Web 4 networks are essentially immune to the kind of surveillance that chat control is demanding. There are no corporate middlemen to coerce or subpoena. The protocols are open source, and they're governed by global mathematical consensus. No government can force a centralized software update to implement client-side scanning, because if they try, the decentralized network simply routes around the damage. It quite literally renders sweeping state surveillance technically impossible.
And it really brings us to the final line in the sand. The resurrection of chat control kind of proves that within our current centralized web, privacy is just a luxury that can be legislated away at any moment. So, I want to leave you with this to think about. As this technology rolls out and becomes the norm, will you accept a future of permanent digital monitoring, or will you migrate to the autonomous, unscannable architecture of Web 4? The battle for the internet isn't some distant sci-fi concept. It is happening right now on the screen in front of you. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking questions, and I'll see you next time.